Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt, President of the Institute of Lutheran Theology. And the title of the lecture today is, Why is Philosophy Important in the Study of Theology? Well, I believe that philosophy is important for the study of theology. I have many reasons why I believe this is so. And I'm going to present those to you today, and I'm going to try to argue that you should also believe that philosophy is important in the study of theology. In fact, I believe they are sister disciplines in many ways. The first reason I have why philosophy is important in the study of theology is that, like theology, philosophy deals with the ultimate questions of human being. So obviously, if theology is examining these things, it should be of interest to theology how philosophers for the last 4,000 or 5,000 years have been answering these questions and asking these questions. A second reason why I believe that philosophy is important for the study of theology is that, like theology, philosophy is a discipline. That is, an organized set of questions and organized procedures by which these questions are addressed and answered. Historically, of course, theology became a discipline, but the discipline that it had to model itself on was philosophy. Philosophy had become a discipline in the ancient world, and when theology went theoretical, if you will, that is to say, after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus the Christ, a couple centuries after that, when it became time to really work up systematically what this all means, theological eyes were cast back 3-4 centuries to the philosophers. How do philosophers engage questions? So theologians were engaging questions in a disciplined way, and they were modeling this disciplined way of engaging these questions on how philosophers had engaged questions in a disciplined way. Another reason why I believe that philosophy is important for the study of theology is that philosophy is concerned with ontological questions. Ontological questions. There are a lot of words you have to know when you study theology. Ontology is one such word, and we're going to see what ontology means later, but I'll give you a preview. Ontology has to do with this study of being. So any questions having to do with being, and I sometimes like to put a dash there, being. Any study of being is an ontological study, right? And of course, philosophers for centuries before theology were asking ontological questions. So obviously, when theologians became concerned with working out the significance of Christ for us, Christ being for our being, it became important to look at philosophical conceptions of being and to think about theological being in relation to philosophical being. I don't want to get too abstract here right at the beginning, but trust me on this one. If philosophy is dealing with the study of being, discourse about being, that is going to be of significance to how theology deals with these questions as well. The next issue is the so-called issue of epistemology. Epistemology. Epistemology is that discipline within philosophy that deals with knowing. Episteme, logos, episteme. So it's a discourse about knowing. And philosophers always ask epistemological questions. How do we know this and we don't know that? For instance, a philosopher might say, God exists. And somebody might say, well, how do you know that? Another philosopher. And then the first philosopher would say, well, okay, here's how I know it. And when they give an account of how they know that the proposition God exists is true, when they give an account of how they know it, they're giving an epistemological account, right? Now notice I used the word philosopher there because, of course, philosophers deal with the question of God as well as theologians, and that's why there is, some overlap between these disciplines, and I'm going to try to explain how they might overlap and how they might differ as this lecture proceeds. But at any rate, both philosophy and theology ask ontological questions. Both philosophy and theology ask epistemological questions. And finally, both disciplines make use of logic and semantics. And you're saying, logic? Oh yes, logic. That's logical. When a person's logical, they're rational. Well, when we talk about logic philosophically and narrowly, we're talking about that discipline that deals with inference. What propositions follow from other propositions properly. Now, we can say all kinds of things follow from other propositions, but oftentimes the things we say follow from other propositions don't really follow. For instance, one might say, if one spends money on education, SAT scores will increase. And then one might say, but we're not spending any more money on education. We're not spending any more money on education. So what can we conclude from this? And there's always someone out at the state legislature who will say, well, that will mean that SAT scores will not increase. Of course, this does not follow at all. This is a logical fallacy. It's called the fallacy of denying the antecedent. If A, then B, not A, you don't know anything about B from the denial of A. So at any rate, logic is studied in philosophy, and theologians make use of all kinds of logic when they dispute with each other and when they write theological tracts. But in my opinion, even more important than this is semantics. Semantics deals with the truth and meaning of propositions. The truth and meaning of propositions. Philosophers, of course, are interested in the truth and meaning of propositions, and they always have been, because, of course, they've noticed that, a person can say something and mean something quite different from what another person might take that locution to mean. For instance, Sally says to Bob, proposition P, Sally takes it in way P, and Bob might take it in a way that's Q, right? So Bob's hearing something in Sally's proposition that maybe is consistent with what Sally said, but is not what Sally meant. So semantics deals with what is meant. Wow. Now, theology must always be concerned with the semantic question, because, of course, we use certain locutions theologically. Take, for instance, the Apostles' Creed, right? Just think that in your head. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Okay, what does that mean? Well, what does it mean to be a maker? What is heaven and earth? And so, while it seems like it would be very clear what this means, I'm going to show you later in the lecture that locutions that seem clear can mean something quite different to very deep minds who are thinking in different ways. Also, it's important to study philosophy because, of course, philosophy, at least classically, dealt with worldly wisdom. Now, you need to know this. When people in the 16th and 17th century talked about philosophy, they basically meant worldly wisdom, not just philosophical, but in those days, philosophy encompassed everything. So natural philosophy was part of what we now call natural science. Political philosophy is now sometimes covered, some of it anyway, in political science. Philosophy of mind is now covered to some degree anyway in psychology. Philosophy of language is covered to some degree in linguistics, and the list goes on and on. Okay? So in the ancient world, philosophy was just that pursuit of wisdom using our best lights. So one wouldn't say, oh, science ends here and philosophy begins there, right? Because what we call the special sciences were all part of philosophy widely conceived as that pursuit of knowledge using our own best lights. And the final point I want to make here, why the study of philosophy is important for studying theology, is that philosophical knowledge, that is to say definite philosophical content, is presupposed in most theology. And this is particularly true when one looks at theology up until very recently. Up through the Reformation period, to understand a theologian, you should probably know quite a bit about Plato, and maybe even more about Aristotle, because you're not going to be able to follow the arguments very well if you don't. After that, it became important to know quite a bit about Kant later on, and after that, it's been a little bit more troubling here in recent times to know exactly what one needs to know in order to understand what theologians are talking about. So, I'll leave that one as it is for now. So, if philosophy is so important in the study of theology, well, why does it get ignored so often in the standard theological curriculum as we see them in our seminaries today? Well, first answer is that there's not enough time to study it. There simply is not enough time, oftentimes in the average curriculum. Let's say it's 120 hours, you got an internship in there, 90 hours maybe of classes. Everybody wants, so many courses in Bible, so many courses in systematics, so many courses in historical theology, courses in practical ministry, and of course those are growing and growing and growing. And so there's not enough time in the curriculum to study it. Now, this, of course, problem is further exacerbated by the fact that not very many people major in philosophy anymore. Why is that? Well, not very many people know what it is, and not very many teachers know what it is. And when students wander into it, they find out, well, gee, this is a lot harder than we thought. My students always found that philosophy was a lot harder than they thought. And it is indeed the case, or it was last time I checked, that of course students with the highest ACT and SACT scores tended to major in either mathematics or philosophy, so you got a bunch of high IQ kids in there, and if you go to a prestigious place, they're dealing with some very deep problems, and most people who would go to do a thing like that, studying, let's say, philosophy at MIT, okay, probably aren't going to go to a Lutheran seminary or any seminary at all. So they're probably engaged in those pursuits as the end and not as a means to become better theologians, better proclaimers of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Another reason why philosophy is not pursued in the seminary is there's no one there competent to teach it. Oftentimes theologians take a picture of philosophy that might have been the case 30 years ago, and then they write books about how theology might connect to philosophy, but they don't know what's going on in philosophy right now. The average theologian is not reading mind or philosophy and phenomenological research, and so the average theologian is responding to questions that might have arisen in philosophy decades ago, if they even know that. Also, we find that in a lot of seminaries, theological faculty in large major no longer value philosophy. Well, how come they do not any longer value it? Well, because they don't know what it is. And when they look at it, they don't know what it means. For instance, they're reading a paper by a philosopher, and the philosopher might say this: now, that doesn't look like the kind of thing that's easy to see and know. It says that there is something, and only one thing, that's an X, that has the property P, or it has some property Y. Okay, so that's it is the case that philosophy these days is pretty technical, and you have to sort of know some set theory, and certainly, you have to know standard predicate calculus or predicate logic in order to follow a lot of the arguments. So this looks like the kind of thing that's quite imposing, and it sure seems a long way away from helping people. And of course, a lot of theologians believe that theology is all about helping students help people. And whether they say that directly or not, that's often where it goes, because of course the kinds of theology that we study, oftentimes in the current contemporary horizon, are theologies that deal with specific groups. Now, of course, I'll go back a few years, but of course black theology dealt with black experience, feminist theology, we have womanist theology, which is different than feminist theology. Of course, theologies of liberation of various kinds, transgendered theology. So we have theology dealing with the experience of being transgendered, and oftentimes these theologians are very interested in the experience of a particular person.